Chapter 1 Two Small Shadows. The Lin family mansion and the Jiang family estate stood on the same quiet street in the hills above the city, separated only by a low stone wall and a row of magnolia trees. It was over that wall, on a spring afternoon when he was 5 years old, that Jiang Chen first saw Lin Yue. The boy was sitting alone in a wheelchair on the veranda, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm weather, watching the petals drift down from the magnolias like he was counting them. He was pale in a way that made Jiang Chen think of the porcelain dolls his grandmother collected, beautiful, but somehow breakable. "Hey!" Jiang Chen called out, climbing halfway up the wall. "Why are you just sitting there? Don't you want to play?" Lin Yue looked up, startled, then embarrassed. "I can't run," he said quietly. "My heart isn't strong. The doctor says I have to rest a lot." Jiang Chen, who had never in his life been told to sit still, found this both baffling and heartbreaking. He hopped down from the wall, marched across the Lin family's garden as if he owned it, and plopped himself down on the veranda steps beside the wheelchair. "Then I'll sit too," he announced. "We can watch the flowers fall together." That's still playing. It was such a small thing. But Lin Yue, who had spent 5 years being looked at by doctors and pitted by relatives and treated like something that might shatter if handled wrong, had never had anyone simply sit with him before, asking nothing, expecting nothing, just choosing to stay. That was how it began. Their families were old friends. The Jiangs ran a shipping conglomerate, the Lins a network of hospitals and pharmaceutical research labs. Fittingly, given how much of the Lin fortune had already been spent chasing a cure for their only son's failing heart. Congenital, the specialists said. A defect in the valve, compounded by a rare weakness in the heart muscle itself. Not immediately fatal. Not curable either. Something to be managed, they said, with the careful, clinical optimism of doctors who did not want to say the word shortened out loud. Lin Yue's parents tried everything money could buy. Specialists flown in from Switzerland, experimental treatments from Germany, a diet monitored to the gram, a schedule that accounted for every heartbeat he was allowed to spend on exertion. And still, every winter he caught pneumonia. Every summer, the heat made his lips turn faintly blue by afternoon. He fainted twice in primary school, once during a fire drill and once during nothing at all, just standing in a hallway. Through all of it, Jiang Chen was there. He was the one who carried Lin Yue's bag when the halls were too long. He was the one who punched a boy in 3rd grade for calling Lin Yue the ghost, because of how pale he was, and then cried harder than Lin Yue did when both their mothers scolded him for fighting. He was the one who, at 8 years old, solemnly informed his tutor that he would be needing to learn extra biology, so I can figure out how to fix Yueji's heart when I grow up, which made both their mothers laugh and then quietly wipe their eyes when the boys weren't looking. They grew up like 2 trees planted from the same root, separate trunks, but branches so entwined that no one could quite say anymore where one boy's happiness ended and the other's began. Jiang Chen brought the world to Lin Yue when Lin Yue's body wouldn't let him go out and meet it. Full reports on the movies he'd seen, detailed descriptions of the sea he'd visited on vacation. A jar of sand from the beach because you should have a piece of it even if you couldn't come. Lin Yue, in turn, gave Jiang Chen something steadier, patience, a listening ear, a way of looking at the world slowly, carefully, that grounded Jiang Chen's restless energy. "When we grow up," Jiang Chen said once, when they were 12, lying side by side on the grass in the Lin garden because Lin Yue wasn't allowed to climb trees but could, on good days, lie on a blanket outside. "I'm going to build you a house with no stairs at all, so your heart never has to work hard, and a garden with every flower in the world. And I'll never let anything bad happen to you. Promise." Lin Yue had laughed, a soft, breathless sound. "That's a big promise for someone who can't even promise to finish his vegetables." "I mean it," Jiang Chen said, so seriously that Lin Yue's laughter faded into something warmer, something he didn't yet have a name for. "I always mean it when it's about you." Lin Yue turned his face toward the sky and let himself, just for a moment, believe that maybe some promises could be kept. Their childhood took on a rhythm shaped entirely around Lin Yue's heart. Though neither boy thought of it that way at the time, it was simply how things were. Mornings meant tutors who came to the house, since long days at school were only possible a few times a week. Afternoons meant Jiang Chen arriving, school bag still on his back, breathless from having run the whole way from his own tutoring sessions, ready to report everything that had happened in the hours they'd been apart, as if Lin Yue had been gone on a long journey rather than simply resting at home. There were bad years and better years. The bad years came in waves. A winter when Lin Yue was hospitalized twice with pneumonia that his weakened heart struggled to pump enough oxygen through. A summer when a new medication regimen left him nauseous and thin for months before the dosage was finally corrected. During the worst of it, Jiang Chen's mother would sometimes find her son sitting outside Lin Yue's hospital room long past visiting hours, refusing to go home, insisting in the stubborn logic of a child that Lin Yue's heart would know he was close by even through a wall, and that this somehow helped. "You can't fix him by sitting there, Chener," she told him gently more than once. "I know," he'd say, "but I can make sure he's not alone while his body is trying to fix itself. That's different." It was during one of the better years, when Lin Yue was 10 and had been granted, after months of careful monitoring, permission for short, gentle walks in the garden without the wheelchair, that Jiang Chen decided to teach him to skip stones, an activity that required, he insisted, basically no heart at all, just wrist. Lin Yue's stones sank on the first bounce, every single time, for weeks, while Jiang Chen's skipped 6, 7, once even 9 times across the surface of the garden's ornamental pond. Lin Yue never once managed more than 2 skips in all the years they practiced together, and it became, eventually, not a source of frustration but a kind of running joke between them. Jiang Chen would count aloud, exaggerating the drama of each bounce, and Lin Yue would laugh so hard he'd have to sit down on the pond's edge to catch his breath. The good kind of breathlessness, the kind that came from joy rather than illness. Their parents, watching the 2 boys grow into each other's lives so completely, began half-jokingly referring to them as a single unit, the Jiang-Lin problem. Lin Yue's father called them once, fondly, when the household staff needed to know how many place settings to prepare for a family dinner. Since it had become simply assumed that wherever one boy was invited, the other would already be there. By the time middle school arrived, the 2 of them had built a private language of jokes and references only they understood. A friendship so deeply rooted that neither imagined anything could shake it. They did not yet know how much a single new person, and a single season of distraction, could still manage to do. Chapter 2. The Season of Silence. High school changed the shape of things the way high school always does. They were still at the same school, the Jiang and Lin parents had made sure of that. But the campus was larger, the days busier, and for the first time in their lives, there were places Jiang Chen went that Lin Yue's fragile body couldn't follow. Basketball tryouts. Weekend hiking trips with new friends. The ordinary, physical chaos of being 16. It was at basketball practice that Jiang Chen met Meng Shui. She was clever and quick-tongued and good at making a boy feel like the most interesting person in the room, and Jiang Chen, flattered and a little lonely in the way that popular, busy teenagers sometimes are, found himself drawn in. She sat with him at lunch. She texted him about nothing in particular late at night. She laughed at his jokes in a way that made him feel, for the first time, like someone other than Lin Yue's shadow guardian, like a boy who existed for his own sake. He didn't mean to pull away from Lin Yue. He would have said, if anyone had asked him, that of course nothing had changed, that Lin Yue was still the most important person in his life. But days that used to be split evenly began to lean more and more toward Meng Shui's side of the scale. Visits that used to happen every afternoon became every other afternoon, then twice a week, then whenever he had time. Lin Yue never said anything. He had spent his whole life learning not to ask for things, not to be a burden, not to want more than his weak heart already cost the people who loved him. So when Jiang Chen canceled on him, again to go to a movie with Meng Shui and her friends, Lin Yue just said, "That's fine, go have fun," and then sat alone in his room, listening to the silence, telling himself it didn't hurt as much as it did. Meng Shui was not a fool. She noticed, with the sharp instinct of someone used to being the center of attention, that there was a rival for Jiang Chen's devotion. Not a girl, but a boy, thin and sickly and utterly unthreatening to look at, and yet somehow the one person Jiang Chen's eyes still softened for, even when he wasn't paying attention to doing it. So she began, quietly, to make things harder. Started small. A comment dropped in front of mutual friends. "It's kind of sad, honestly, how Jiang Chen has to babysit him all the time. Don't you think? Must be exhausting to always be the strong one." Rumors that reached Lin Yue's ears in roundabout ways, dressed up as concern. "Did you hear people think you're using Jiang Chen's guilt to keep him around? A carefully engineered accident. where Meng Shui arranged for Jiang Chen to be needed at a group project meeting on the exact afternoon Lin Yue had a hospital checkup he'd hoped Jiang Chen would come to, as he always used to. Worse than any of it was the whispering campaign she waged among classmates who didn't know Lin Yue well, that he was manipulative, that he faked how sick he sometimes seemed for sympathy, that he resented anyone Jiang Chen cared about besides him. Cruel, baseless things, the kind of poison that spreads fastest among people who have no reason to doubt it. Lin Yue heard fragments of all of it. He said nothing to Jiang Chen. What was there to say? Your girlfriend is turning people against me sounded, even in his own head, like exactly the kind of jealous, needy accusation Meng Shui had already primed everyone to expect from him. So instead he grew quieter. He stopped attending the few school events his health allowed. He ate lunch alone in the nurse's office instead of the cafeteria. His health, already fragile, seemed to worsen under the weight of loneliness and stress. His color grew worse, his appetite thinner, and one bitter February afternoon, he collapsed in an empty stairwell and lay there for 11 minutes before a janitor found him. He spent 4 days in the hospital. Jiang Chen visited exactly once, distracted, in a hurry, because Meng Shui had a recital that evening and he'd promised to be there. He didn't notice, in his rush, the particular hollowness in Lin Yue's eyes, the look of someone who has quietly decided that he no longer matters enough to interrupt anyone's plans. Before that final collapse, there had been 100 smaller wounds Lin Yue simply absorbed and said nothing about. There was the group chat for their year where Meng Shui had, with practiced casualness, floated the idea that Lin Yue only ever came to school events to make sure Jiang Chen doesn't have too much fun without him. A comment that got a few sympathetic laughs and that Lin Yue saw with his own eyes, screenshot to him by a classmate who thought he ought to know, though he wished afterward that he hadn't. There was the time Meng Shui accidentally let it slip to a teacher that Lin Yue had been seen at a fast food restaurant eating fried chicken, in direct violation, she implied with wide, innocent eyes, of the strict diet everyone knew his heart condition required. A small, humiliating scene in front of classmates that left Lin Yue too embarrassed to explain that the chicken had, in fact, been a rare, doctor-approved treat for his birthday. Each incident alone might have been survivable. It was the accumulation that wore him down, the sense that somewhere, quietly, a narrative about him was being written by someone he'd never even had a real conversation with, and that he had no way to correct it without sounding exactly as petty and needy as she'd already convinced people he was. He began keeping a small, private list in the back of a notebook, not of grievances, but of proof he might one day need: dates, screenshots, names of who'd said what, though he never quite let himself believe he'd have the courage to use it. Meanwhile, Jiang Chen's absence from Lin Yue's daily life became so normalized that even Lin Yue's own parents, distracted by the ordinary business of running a hospital network, didn't immediately notice how quiet their son had become at dinner, how often he claimed to be too tired for visits that used to be the highlight of his week, how the light that had always lived behind his eyes when Jiang Chen's name came up had dimmed to something flatter, more careful. It was Lin Yue's mother, gray-faced with fear and fury in equal measure, who finally called the Jiang household and, in a voice she had never once raised to them in 20 years of friendship, demanded to know where her son's oldest friend had disappeared to. Chapter 3. What the Silence Cost. Jiang Chen arrived at the hospital that night to find Lin Yue's mother waiting for him in the corridor. Her arms crossed, her eyes red-rimmed. He almost died in a stairwell, Chener, she said, and her voice shook. Alone. For 11 minutes. Do you know what that does to a heart like his? Jiang Chen felt something in his chest crack open. I didn't know he collapsed. I thought, the fever, they said it was just a fever. Because he told the nurses that so you wouldn't worry, she said. Because that is what he always does. He would rather die quietly than ask you to put down whatever you're holding. Jiang Chen went in to see him. Lin Yue was asleep, tubes in his arm, monitors softly beeping beside the bed, and in the dim hospital light he looked smaller than Jiang Chen had ever seen him. Smaller than he had looked even as a child in that wheelchair on the veranda. That night, sitting beside the bed until dawn, Jiang Chen finally began asking the questions he should have asked months ago. He called their old classmates. He talked to the nurse who'd found Lin Yue in the stairwell and pieced together the timeline, the missed checkup, the isolation, the rumors. Slowly, sickeningly, the shape of the last several months came into focus, and Meng Shui's fingerprints were all over it. He confronted her the next day, in front of the same group of mutual friends she'd used to spread her stories. "You told people he fakes his illness," Jiang Chen said, his voice very quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. "You made sure I wasn't there when he needed me. You let him think it was his fault that I stopped showing up." Meng Shui tried, at first, to laugh it off. "You're overreacting, he's just sensitive, I never said anything that bad." But Jiang Chen laid it all out, message by message, second-hand account by second-hand account, until there was no laughing it off left to do. He didn't scream at her. He didn't need to. He simply, publicly, methodically dismantled every story she had built, told their mutual friends exactly what she had done and why, and made certain that whatever social currency she'd spent months accumulating was gone by the end of that week. Word traveled fast in a school that small. By the following month, Meng Shui had transferred elsewhere, unable to bear the way people now looked at her. But dismantling her didn't undo what had already been done. Jiang Chen understood that only when he sat back down at Lin Yue's bedside and Lin Yue finally woke, looked at him with tired, wary eyes and asked, "Why are you here? Don't you have somewhere to be?" It was such a small sentence. It broke something in Jiang Chen more thoroughly than any shouting could have. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it with his whole chest. "I'm so sorry, you. I let myself get distracted and I let you carry all of this alone. And that's the worst thing I've ever done. I don't have an excuse. I just have an apology. And I know that's not enough, but I'm going to spend however long it takes making it enough." Lin Yue didn't answer right away. Old hurt doesn't dissolve just because someone finally says sorry. But Jiang Chen didn't leave. He came every day after that. Every single day, through the rest of Lin Yue's hospital stay and long after, showing up not with grand gestures but with the boring, steady reliability he'd abandoned for a season. Homework brought over, favorite soup smuggled past hospital cafeteria rules, quiet company on afternoons that needed nothing more than someone sitting there. Slowly, the old rhythm returned. And in its returning, something in it had changed, deepened, sharpened into a kind of clarity neither of them had let themselves look at directly before. It was Lin Yue who said it first, months later, on a warm evening on that same veranda where it had all begun, watching the same magnolia trees shed their petals over the low stone wall. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that I was scared of dying young. But when you weren't here, I realized what actually scared me was a version of my life where I lived a long time and you weren't in it. That's not just missing a friend, is it, Chun?" Jiang Chen turned to look at him, something in his throat too tight to speak for a moment. "No," he finally said. "It's not. I've loved you as my best friend since I was 5 years old. You. And somewhere along the way, without me really noticing when that turned into just loving you. All the way. The kind of loving that doesn't have a smaller word for it." Lin Yue reached over, slowly, and laced their fingers together, the way he'd never quite dared to before. His pulse, weak and irregular as it was, fluttered against Jiang Chen's wrist like something trying, against every medical odds, to fly. "Then don't get distracted again," Lin Yue said, half a laugh, half a plea. "Never again," Jiang Chen promised. And this time, the promise had roots deep enough to hold that it took longer than either of them expected for Lin Yue's health to recover its old, careful baseline after that winter. The stress and isolation had left their mark, and it was months before his cardiologist stopped using words like concerning at each checkup. Jiang Chen attended every single one of those appointments after that, sitting close enough that his knee pressed against Lin Yue's, asking the doctor blunt, sometimes uncomfortable questions he'd never thought to ask before, determined never again to let ignorance be the reason he failed to notice his person suffering. He also, in a quieter and more private reckoning, spent a long evening apologizing to Lin Yue's parents, who had watched the whole unraveling with the particular helplessness of people who loved a fragile child and could do nothing but wait for someone else to notice what they already saw. Lin Yue's mother, who had been the one to finally call his household in fury, held his hands afterward and said, "I forgive you. But don't make me have to be the one who calls again." He never did. The two of them spent that spring relearning each other in the new light of what they'd almost lost. Not just as friends now, or as something not quite named, but openly, tentatively, as something neither of them had dared claim outright, until the evening on the veranda made it real. Their first proper date, if it could be called that, was almost aggressively ordinary. instant noodles eaten on Lin Yue's bedroom floor because he was too tired to sit at a table, an old movie neither of them finished watching because they fell asleep leaning against each other before the credits, and in the morning, Lin Yue waking to find Jiang Chen still there, having stayed the whole night rather than risk another season of distance, and understanding, in that quiet, unremarkable moment, that this not grand gestures but simple unwavering presence was what being loved by Jiang Chen would always actually look like. Chapter 4: Building Something of Their Own. University came, and with it, an unspoken agreement that they would not be separated again by anything. Not distance, not distraction, not anyone's opinion of what two young men from prominent families should or shouldn't be to each other. Both sets of parents, who had watched the boys grow up in each other's pockets for over a decade, took the news of their relationship with far less shock than either of them had feared. Lin Yue's mother cried, but it was the relieved kind of crying. "I've watched you love him since you were 5, she told Jiang Chen. "I would have been more surprised if you'd ended up with anyone else." They studied different things, Jiang Chen international business, sharpening the instincts he'd need to eventually run his family's shipping empire, and Lin Yue, against everyone's expectations, biomedical engineering, driven by a lifetime of watching doctors fail to understand hearts like his and a stubborn wish to change that math for people who came after him, even if he couldn't change it for himself in time. He was frank about that possibility, in the quiet way he'd always been frank about his condition. "The specialists still don't think I'll see 50, he told Jiang Chen once, in their small shared apartment near campus. In a tone so matter-of-fact it took Jiang Chen's breath away every time. "Maybe not even 40 if the valve degenerates the way they think it might. I'm not saying it to be dramatic. I just don't want us building a life together where you're surprised by that later. I want you to choose this with open eyes." Jiang Chen had taken his face in both hands, then, and kissed him slow and certain. "I've had open eyes about you since I was 5 years old, sitting on your veranda steps," he said. "I'm not choosing a number of years, I'm choosing you. However many there are." They graduated within a year of each other and, instead of stepping neatly into their father's companies as expected, chose to build something of their own. A joint venture that married the Jiang family's logistics expertise with the Lin family's medical research focus. A company devoted to making advanced cardiac equipment and telemedicine affordable and available in places that had never had access to either. It felt, to both of them, less like a business decision and more like a promise made real. Lin Yue's decade of watching doctors try and fail to fix hearts like his turned into something that might help other fragile hearts beat a little longer, a little easier, even after his own eventually stopped. The company struggled at first, the way all real things do, but Jiang Chen's relentless drive and Lin Yue's careful, brilliant mind for the actual science of what they were building complemented each other the way they always had. One of them running ahead, the other making sure the ground didn't collapse beneath his feet. Within 5 years, their devices were in hospitals across a dozen countries. Within 7, they had become the kind of quiet, respected success story that industry magazines liked to profile. The childhood friends turned life partners turned unlikely titans. As one particularly sentimental article called them, much to Lin Yue's blushing embarrassment and Jiang Chen's undisguised pride. They married in a small ceremony in the same garden where they'd grown up, under the same magnolia trees, now decades older, their branches thick and generous with blossoms that fell in slow spirals over the small gathering of family and closest friends. Lin Yue wore white, his face pale but radiant, his hands steady in Jiang Chen's as they exchanged vows that both of them, without planning it, ended with some version of the same phrase they'd been saying to each other in different words since they were children. "I choose you, however long there is." Lin Yue's mother cried through the entire ceremony, though by her own later admission she had cried through most major events in her son's life, both the frightening ones and the joyful ones, and had simply stopped trying to tell the two kinds apart. Jiang Chen's father, a famously reserved man who ran one of the largest shipping companies in the country with an iron composure that rarely cracked in public, was seen wiping his eyes twice, once during the vows, and once when a very old, slightly arthritic family dog belonging to a neighbor wandered uninvited into the ceremony and settled directly at Lin Yue's feet as if determined to be included, prompting Lin Yue to laugh so hard through his own vows that the officiant had to pause. There was a moment late in the reception, when Lin Yue slipped away from the crowd of well-wishers to sit alone for a few minutes on the same veranda step where it had all begun, catching his breath the way he still sometimes needed to after a long, exciting day. Jiang Chen found him there within minutes, He always did, some instinct honed over 30 years, always knowing exactly where to look, and sat down beside him without a word, the way he had at 5 years old, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply choosing once again to stay. Tired? Jiang Chen asked softly. Happy? Lin Yue corrected, leaning his head against his husband's shoulder, as the last of the magnolia petals drifted down around them in the fading evening light. So happy my heart doesn't quite know what to do with all of it. But in a good way. I promise, in a good way. There were struggles in those early years that no magazine profile would ever capture. Investors, when the two of them first pitched their joint venture, were politely skeptical of a company co-founded by a young man whose own medical file read like a cautionary tale about long-term reliability. Several early meetings ended with vague promises to stay in touch, that both men understood. Walking out meant no. Jiang Chen learned to pitch alone in rooms where Lin Yue's health might raise unspoken doubts, and then came home each time to describe the meeting in exhaustive, faithful detail, unwilling to let Lin Yue feel shut out of a company that existed, in its truest sense, because of him. There was also the harder, more private struggle of learning to build a shared life around a body that didn't always cooperate with either of their plans. Late nights working on funding proposals sometimes had to stop abruptly because Lin Yue's heart rate spiked from stress and needed monitoring instead. Weekend trips got rescheduled, sometimes at the last possible hour, because of a bad morning that turned into a hospital visit that turned into 2 lost days. Jiang Chen never once complained about it aloud, but Lin Yue noticed, in the small, guilty way he'd always noticed such things, and one evening, exhausted and frustrated with his own body after a canceled dinner with an important supplier, he finally said so. You gave up an entire evening with someone who could have funded next year's research budget, because I couldn't get off the couch, he said, staring at the ceiling rather than at Jiang Chen. You must resent this sometimes. I would if I were you. Jiang Chen had climbed into the bed beside him without hesitation. I chose a life with you in it, you, not a life around your convenience, he said. There's a difference between resentment and rearranging. I rearrange. I don't resent. If you ever catch me resenting you, you have my permission to remind me, loudly, of every single year you spent loving me back without ever once making me feel like a burden for needing you close. Deal? Deal? Lin Yue said, voice thick, and let himself, finally, be held without guilt. It was, by every measure that mattered to either of them, a good life. Not an easy one. There were hospital visits scattered through even the happiest years, medications that had to be managed with obsessive care. Activities Lin Yue simply couldn't do that. Jiang Chen quietly rearranged their whole life around so the absence never felt sharp. But it was full. It was theirs. And for a long time it was enough to make both of them forget, on the good days, that there was ever a clock running underneath it. Chapter 5. A small, new heartbeat. They had talked over the years about children the way people talk about distant weather, a maybe, a someday, a thing to consider once the company stabilized, once Lin Yue's health held steady enough, once the timing felt right. The doctors were cautious but not discouraging about adoption specifically. It was pregnancy and its physical demands that would have been out of the question for Lin Yue's heart, not parenthood itself. The someday arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. When Jiang Chen came home holding a folder from the adoption agency they'd quietly been in contact with for the better part of a year, and said, simply, there's a little girl, 8 months old. They think she'd be a good fit for us, if we want to meet her. They named her Tang Wan Wan, meaning gentle, complete. The day they brought her home, a small, solemn-eyed baby who stopped crying almost the moment Lin Yue picked her up, as though some ancient instinct in her recognized a gentleness that matched her own name. A month later, on a whim that turned into an argument that turned into a compromise, they also brought home a scruffy golden retriever puppy from a shelter near their office, whom Wan Wan, still too young to say much of anything else clearly, insisted on calling Dodo for reasons no adult ever fully understood. The house that Jiang Chen had promised, all those years ago on the grass in Lin Yue's garden. A house with no stairs, so his heart never had to work too hard, had, in fact, been built, sprawling and single-storied and full of light, and it was in that house that their small, strange family took shape. 2 fathers, a solemn baby girl who grew, month by month, into a bright and stubborn toddler, and a golden dog who appointed himself her permanent shadow, sleeping outside her door every night as, though standing guard. The adoption process itself had not been simple. Agencies asked careful, probing questions about Lin Yue's health, about long-term stability, about who would care for a child if one parent's condition worsened. Questions that stung even when asked with the gentlest of intentions, because they forced both men to say out loud, to strangers, the quiet math they usually only let themselves think in private. Jiang Chen had answered every one of those questions with a steadiness that surprised even him. "My husband's heart is fragile," he told the caseworker plainly, during their final interview. "That's true, and I won't pretend otherwise. But fragile isn't the same as absent. Whatever time he has, he intends to spend loving a child completely, and I intend to make sure that love never runs short, no matter what happens to either of us. I don't think a good home requires guaranteed decades. I think it requires everything you have while you have it." The caseworker, a woman who had heard 1,000 rehearsed answers in her career, wrote something down and did not ask a follow-up question. A month later, they were approved. Wan had come to them thin and watchful, the way infants sometimes are when the first months of their life have been uncertain. But within weeks of arriving in the house with no stairs, she began to unfurl, reaching for Lin Yue's face with small, curious fingers during feedings, falling asleep faster against his chest than in her own crib, as though some part of her recognized in his careful, unhurried way of holding her a kindness that didn't need to be rushed. Jiang Chen, watching them together those first months, felt something in his own chest settle into place that he hadn't known was unsettled. The last piece, perhaps, of the life he'd been quietly building toward since he was 5 years old and decided to sit down beside a lonely boy in a wheelchair instead of walking away. Lin Yue adored her with a ferocity that surprised even him. He had spent so much of his life being cared for, that being the one who did the caring, who got up at odd hours despite doctors' orders about overexertion, who insisted on being the one to read her bedtime stories even when his hands trembled turning the pages, who cried, quietly and without embarrassment, the first time she called him Baba, felt like a kind of homecoming he hadn't known he needed. It was around Wan's second birthday that Lin Yue's cardiologist, in a private conversation Jiang Chen was not meant to overhear but did, used a phrase that changed the quiet math running under their happy life. "The valve is degenerating faster than we projected. I'd plan, realistically, for 1 to 3 years, perhaps a bit more with careful management, but I want you both prepared." Jiang Chen did not tell Lin Yue he'd heard. Lin Yue, for his part, had already guessed, had felt it, in the particular new tiredness that crept into ordinary afternoons, in the way climbing the 2 shallow steps to the garden now left him breathless where it hadn't the year before. He said nothing either, for a long while, not out of the old instinct to spare others his burdens, but out of something gentler. He wanted, for as long as possible, for their days to simply be their days, uncomplicated by a countdown neither of them could stop. But love, real love, doesn't stay unspoken for long between two people who have never really been able to hide anything from each other. One night, after Wan had finally been coaxed to sleep and Do had taken up his usual post outside her door, Lin Yue found Jiang Chen standing very still in the hallway, staring at nothing, and understood immediately that he knew. "You heard the doctor," Lin Yue said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jiang Chen's jaw worked for a moment before he could speak. "How long have you known?" "About as long as you have, probably." "I felt it before he said it." Lin Yue took his husband's hand, the way he had on that veranda so many years ago, and led him to sit on the small bench in the hallway, beneath the framed photo of their wedding day. "Chen, I need you to hear something, and I need you to really hear it, not just let it wash over you and pretend later that you didn't." Jiang Chen nodded, throat too tight for words. "I'm not scared of dying," Lin Yue said, steady. "I've lived with that fear my whole life, since I was old enough to understand what the doctors meant when they lowered their voices around my parents. What I'm scared of now is different. I'm scared of leaving Wan too young to remember me clearly. I'm scared of leaving you to raise her alone and carry all of it by yourself." He tightened his grip on Jiang Chen's hand. "So I need you to promise me something. Not the way you used to promise things when we were kids, big and easy. I need you to really mean this one. Anything," Jiang Chen said, voice breaking. "Anything, you. Love her the way you've loved me," Lin Yue said. "All the way, without holding anything back because you're afraid of losing her too. Let her be loud. Let her be difficult. Let her make mistakes. And love her through every bit of it the way you've loved every difficult, exhausting, sickly year of loving me. Don't let my leaving make you smaller with her. Let it make you bigger if you can. For her sake. Jiang Chen pressed his forehead against Lin Yue's, both of them shaking now, quietly, in the dim hallway light. I promise, he said. I promise you. She'll never doubt for a single day of her life that she's loved completely. I'll make sure of it. The way I made sure of you. Chapter 6. The years that were given. They did not tell Wan, not directly, not in words a 3-year-old could hold. But children understand more than adults give them credit for, in their own sideways fashion, and Wan seemed to sense, in some wordless way, that her Baba's hugs had started lasting a little longer, that her Papa watched them both a little more carefully than before, that there was a tenderness in the house that felt, somehow, deliberate, as though everyone in it had quietly agreed to notice each other more. They made memories the way people make memories when they know time is a resource being spent, not saved, deliberately, without waste. A trip to the seaside, where Lin Yue, wrapped in blankets against the wind even in summer, sat in a folding chair on the sand and watched Jiang Chen chase a shrieking, delighted Wan through the shallows with Dodo barking circles around them both, and thought that if he had to choose one image to keep with him past the end of everything, it might be this one. 100 small, ordinary evenings of reading to her before bed. His voice growing softer with fatigue some nights but never stopping until the story was done. A garden, replanted with her help, clumsy small hands pressing bulbs too shallow into the dirt, that bloomed the following spring in a chaos of color that made Lin Yue laugh until he coughed, delighted by how badly they'd planned it and how beautifully it had turned out anyway. He kept a small journal for her in those years. Not a diary of his illness, which he refused to let define these last chapters, but a collection of the ordinary and extraordinary things he wanted her to know once she was old enough to read it. The story of the veranda and the magnolia trees, the promise about the house with no stairs, the specific ridiculous face Jiang Chen made when he lost at cards, the way Dodo always seemed to know before anyone else, when Lin Yue needed to rest and would simply lie down against his legs and refuse to move, as if holding him in place through sheer canine stubbornness. You were the best medicine anyone ever gave me, he wrote, in the entry meant for her 18th birthday, the one he asked Jiang Chen to keep sealed until then. Not because you made my heart stronger, nothing could do that, but because you made whatever time I had feel like more than enough. I hope by the time you read this, you understand that loving you was never a sad thing for me, even at the end. It was the happiest thing I ever did. There was a particular afternoon, when Wan was 5, that Lin Yue would later write about at length in the journal meant for her 18th birthday. She had come home from her first day of a summer art class clutching a lumpy clay shape she insisted, with great seriousness, was a heart, but the good kind, not the sick kind, and had presented it to him with the solemn ceremony of a diplomat delivering treaty documents. Lin Yue had held the misshapen little sculpture in both hands as though it were made of glass, and told her it was the finest heart he had ever been given, which was, in its own way, entirely true, that he kept it on the table beside his bed for the rest of his life. It sat there still, the day the entry about it was finally read. There were harder days too. Days he didn't try to soften even for her future reading. A checkup where the cardiologist's face gave away more than his words did. A night he woke gasping, chest tight, and had to be rushed to the hospital while Jiang Chen carried a sleep-confused Wan next door to stay with a neighbor, promising her he'd be back before she woke. A promise he kept, though barely, and one that cost him a decade of composure to keep his voice steady while making it. Lin Yue wrote about that night too, honestly, because he had decided early on that he did not want his daughter's memory of him to be a myth scrubbed clean of struggle. He wanted her to know a real person had loved her, not a saint, and that the love had been real precisely because it had cost something. The decline, when it came in earnest, came the way the doctors had warned it might. Not suddenly, but in a slow accumulation of smaller losses. Stairs he could no longer manage even briefly. Afternoons that used to hold an hour of gardening shrinking to 10 careful minutes. A wheelchair, reintroduced into his life after decades without one, that he accepted with far more grace at 37 than he ever had at 5, mostly, he said, because it meant he could still be wheeled out to watch the magnolias fall in a garden of his own, with a granddaughter of sorts in his lap, insisting on naming each falling petal after a member of the family. Jiang Chen never once let him see fear on his face, though it lived in him constantly, a low animal hum beneath everything. He simply kept showing up the way he always had. Carrying him when carrying was needed. Sitting with him in silence when silence was what the moment called for. Laughing with him at Wanwan's increasingly elaborate stories about what Dodo really thought about things, and holding him every single night, as though holding on tightly enough might slow whatever clock was running. Chapter 7. The Last Petal and What Bloomed After. The end, when it finally arrived gently, in a way that felt almost like mercy. A quiet spring morning, the magnolia trees outside the bedroom window in full, extravagant bloom, Wanwan curled at the foot of the bed with Dodo pressed against her side, both of them having refused with identical stubbornness to leave. Lin Yue had been fading for days by then, sleeping more than waking, but that morning he opened his eyes clear and lucid, and found Jiang Chen exactly where he'd been every night for weeks. Beside him, hand wrapped around his, having not truly slept in longer than either of them could count. "Chen," he said, voice thin as paper but steady. "Open the window. I want to smell the flowers." Jiang Chen did, though every motion felt like moving through water. The scent of magnolia drifted in, sweet and familiar. The same scent that had hung over a 5-year-old boy sitting quietly on a veranda step beside a wheelchair. 32 years and a whole lifetime ago. "Do you remember?" Lin Yue murmured. "When you told me watching flowers fall still counted as playing?" "I remember everything," Jiang Chen said, and his voice cracked wide open on the last word. "Good," Lin Yue said, and there was, impossibly, a smile in it, small and real. "Remember for me, then. Remember loudly. So she never forgets even the parts she's too young now to hold on to herself." His eyes moved, slow and full of love, to where Wanwan had woken and was watching them both with the wide, uncomprehending seriousness only small children have in the presence of things too big for words. "Wanwan, Baba loves you. Baba will always love you, even from wherever flowers go when they fall. Be good to Papa. He's going to need you to be loud sometimes, when he goes quiet." She didn't fully understand. Not then. But she nodded anyway, solemnly, the way she'd nodded at every important thing said to her since she was old enough to nod, and reached out one small hand to rest it over both her father's joined ones. Lin Yue's eyes found Jiang Chen's one last time. "Thank you," he said, "for 32 years of choosing me. However long there was." "However long there was," Jiang Chen repeated, the old vow between them, worn smooth with use, holding steady even now. "I choose it all again. Every single second, I choose it again." The last breath left him so quietly that for a moment, Jiang Chen wasn't certain it had happened at all. Only the sudden, terrible stillness where a pulse used to flutter under his fingers told him the truth. Outside the window, a petal loosened from the magnolia tree and spiraled slowly down, catching the morning light, and Wanwan, 3 years old and understanding perhaps more than anyone realized, pointed at it and said softly, "Baba," as though she'd decided in that moment that this was where he'd gone. Dodo did not move from the foot of the bed for 3 days. The grief that followed was not gentle, and Jiang Chen did not pretend, to himself or to his daughter, that it was something to be rushed through. There were mornings he could not get out of bed, held only upright by the sound of small feet running down the hallway calling for him, by the weight of a dog who had decided, with the simple loyalty of his kind, that his job now was to never again let this family be alone in a room together. There were nights he took out Lin Yue's journal and read the sealed pages meant for later, unable to stop himself, weeping over handwriting that had grown visibly weaker page by page but never once grown less certain in what it was trying to say. But he had made a promise, and Jiang Chen had never in his life broken a promise made about Lin Yue. So he got up. He learned to braid hair badly and then less badly. He told Wanwan every single story from that journal over and over, until the veranda and the magnolia trees and the boy who never let anyone sit alone became as real to her as any memory of her own. He kept the company running, kept the mission alive. Devices that helped other fragile hearts keep beating a little longer. A legacy Lin Yue had built with his own careful hands, now carrying his name into hospitals he would never see. He replanted the garden every spring with Wanwan's clumsy help, let it bloom exactly as chaotically as it always had, and sat beneath the magnolia trees on quiet afternoons with his daughter in his lap and a graying golden dog at his feet, watching petals fall, and understood, slowly, that this too counted as playing. This too counted as love, still being spent, still being given, in the shape of a life that had been asked of him and that he intended, with everything he had left, to live. Well, there was a particular afternoon, almost a year after the funeral, when Jiang Chen found himself standing at the pond in what had once been Lin Yue's childhood garden. The two families had long since torn down the wall between their properties, joining the gardens into one, the way the two boys who'd grown up on either side of it had joined their lives long before anyone else caught up to the idea. He picked up a flat stone without quite deciding to, the old habit surfacing from some deep muscle memory place, and skipped it across the water. It bounced 6 times before it sank. Wan, 5 years old by then and already possessed of her father's stubborn curiosity, demanded to be taught immediately, and spent the following weeks producing an unbroken string of stones that sank on the first splash, exactly as her babas always had, though she had no way of knowing that. Jiang Chen sat on the pond's edge, counting her failed attempts aloud with exaggerated drama, the way he once had for someone else, and found that somewhere in the middle of her furious, delighted laughter, an old wound he'd been carrying without quite noticing its weight eased, just slightly, for the first time since spring. He did not stop grieving. He understood, slowly, that he was not meant to, that grief, handled honestly, was simply love with nowhere obvious left to go, and that the task in front of him was not to make it disappear but to find it new places to live. In a garden replanted every year, in a journal read aloud one worn page at a time, in a company whose devices kept other fragile hearts beating in hospitals Lin Yue would never see, in a golden dog gone gray at the muzzle who still, every single night without fail, slept outside a little girl's door as though some promise made to a man now gone required it of him. "Tell me about Baba again," Wan would ask some evenings, small and certain in the way only children can be. And Jiang Chen, every time without fail, would smile, a real smile, worn soft with grief but never hollow, and begin again. "Once, when I was 5 years old, I climbed over a wall and found the most important person in my whole life, just sitting quietly, watching the flowers fall." On the 10th anniversary of that spring morning, Jiang Chen and a now teenaged Wan planted a new magnolia sapling at the edge of the garden, beside the old ones, in the spot where the low stone wall had once stood between two families who hadn't yet known how completely their lives would grow together. Dodo, elderly now and slow on his feet but still faithfully present, lay in the grass nearby, watching them dig with the patient, half-closed eyes of a dog who had outlived far more than anyone expected of him. As if he too understood there was something worth witnessing in a new tree taking root in old, familiar ground. "Do you think he'd like it?" Wan asked, patting the soil down around the sapling's base with the same careless, hopeful confidence she'd once used planting bulbs too shallow as a small child. "He'd love it," Jiang Chen said, and meant it completely. He always said flowers falling still counted as playing. I think he'd say the same thing about planting them. Outside, the magnolias kept blooming, the way they always had, the way, perhaps, they always would, losing their petals every spring only to return each year more full than before, as if even flowers understood something about love that never quite finishes, no matter how many endings it survives. End.